The wind had a stubborn way of getting into a man's bones on Utapau. It came up out of the sinkholes in sighs and moans, carrying old mineral dust and the scent of the subterranean sea, and it never seemed to cross the rock cleanly. The cliffs broke it into eddies, so the air curled back on itself, 1,000 tiny whirlwinds at cross purposes. It dragged at robes and armor and banners, and the noise of it, constant, fretful, made even quiet feel troubled. Standing at the lip of one of the great sinkholes, Obi-Wan Kenobi felt the wind pull and pluck, and knew, with a sensation he had not allowed himself to name, that it sought to unmake his usual composure thread by thread. He had tracked General Grievous to this planet of vertical cities hung along the walls of vast round scars in the stone. He had done so with a purpose he wore like a second skin, neither joy nor resentment, only adherence and clarity. He had passed through battle after battle, watched the great gears of this impossible war grind heroes to silt and villains to legend, and still he believed that a simple center could be maintained within himself. A quiet courtyard, no storm could enter. The wind pressed inward, as if to test that belief. Not now, he thought, though he would never have dignified the thought by speaking it aloud. Not yet. Below, Utapau's city lay in tiers around the circumference of the sinkhole, all wood and stone and long graceful arches braced by metal rings. Ramps ran along the curves, doors opened onto faint-lit galleries, and the colors were earth and ocean, ochres and greens and grays, interrupted here and there by republic red and white. He had descended to parley with the planet's leaders, and then, as so often happened, learned that courtesy had been forced to share its table with terror. Grievous was here. Grievous had been here for days, and the whisper of the name was a chill that crawled under even armored skin. The droid general was already on the move, already fitting fresh violence to stale strategy, already arranging his exit. Clone Commander Cody's voice over the comm came with a familiar briskness. "We've got a fix on the general's last position, sir. He's moving along the outer industrial ring. Heavy security. The locals confirm he's maintaining a shuttle on one of the lower landing stages." "Thank you, Cody." Obi-Wan put a hand to the dew-wet railing. Moisture beaded like cold sweat across porcelain. "We should press the advantage before he consolidates. And Cody, remind the men to go carefully. Magnaguards rarely arrive alone." "Now." "Understood." The Varactyl crouched beside him. Massive, clawed, feathered in a spectrum of emeralds and peacock blues, head cocked, eyes glossy, and very old. When Obi-Wan placed a hand on her neck, her muscles brought to mind the braided cables inside a starship, the living analog to engineered tension. She watched him as if she understood more than an animal should, curiosity, and a certain inconvenient affection. "We'll run as we did in the canyons," he murmured, and she chuffed softly, shifting her weight. He had once believed, in the clear-eyed way of a young knight, that the Force resolved itself into obvious patterns where danger was concerned. There would be a discreet brightness when the right path appeared, a shadow when the wrong one laid its trap. With time he had come to trust subtler signs, a note in the music of a place, an odd coolness at the palate, the way dust rose from stone. The wind on Utapau carried a dozen such signs. Some he recognized, some he did not. He listened as he moved, because listening had carried him further than fear ever had. Grievous guards made a visible line across the industrial ring. Electrostaffs held angled downward. Their photoreceptors glowed like watchfires. They regarded the Republic's party wearily, as if they had stood all night and every night for years. Beyond them, the ring jutted over the sinkhole, a rib of industrial decking lined with conduits and storage bins and cranes. Somewhere down along that metal arc, the general would be calibrating his next retreat, while promising some new, sudden advance. He liked to speak through amplification grids that lent him the authority of a ritual. He liked to feint moral dignity, even as he prepared the most indelicate strikes. He liked to live inside the noise he made. Obi-Wan mounted the Varactyl, and the creature's talons spread to hold the treacherous metal lip. At his gesture, clones in orange-striped armor spread along the higher terraces, taking positions with a care that honored their training. He felt them in the Force not as bright flames, clones seldom blazed, but as a steadiness, a formal order. He had long given up on the ease of thinking of them as something less than men. They spoke with their own timbres, laughed in their own ways, had their own private rituals for luck, for grief. The Force did not make exceptions for a man's origins. It accounted for him exactly as he became. "Sir," Cody said quietly, materializing at Obi-Wan's stirrup like a ghost of white enamel and gray eye lenses. "This one's likely a trap." "It's always a trap," Obi-Wan said, and found himself smiling in a mild, unhelpful way. He rode along the curve. The Varactol's claws clanged lightly on the decking. Wind plucked his robe. The sun made knives of the rails and calm green of the water far below. The Magnaguards shifted to face him. Behind them, a small platform supported an open-frame shuttle, a skeletal thing of struts and thrusters. And beside the shuttle, bracketed by two towering droids with electrostaffs set like halberds, stood Grievous. Even at a distance, the general's silhouette was unmistakable. The skull mask of the faceplate gleamed chalk white. Slotted eyes embered with that particular sickly yellow that seemed soldered into fear itself. He carried himself as though his joints were knives, and he was taking care not to cut himself. His armor plate was scuffed and heat-scored, but every scrape had the look of decoration. He let an electro cough roll up out of his chest, as if to remind all listening that his lungs were not his own. When he lifted one hand and gestured, the motion seemed born of a surgeon's obsession with precision and a butcher's acceptance of mess. The sound of his voice came through the ring's loudspeakers, with a crawling intimacy that made it feel as if he stood at the back of your neck. "Kenobi," he said. "So the Council sends its favorite caretaker to fetch what the Council cannot hold. This place, how do you Jedi say it, has a calm that offends me." He half turned, as if admiring the sinkhole's architecture. "I have killed a world in a day. This one would take me 3 if I gave it my full attention. But why spend so much time on a thing that will yield so quickly?" Obi-Wan drew the Varactol up short with a gentle pat. "Grievous, you've run a long way to find a cliff to stand on." "A cliff makes a fine pulpit," Grievous said. "And an altar. And a grave. For someone. And so, your surrender will spare the people here," Obi-Wan said. "And you could ransom yourself in names. You've collected them. We'll take Dooku's private council, the Nemodian financiers, the ones who don't like sunlight, your arms suppliers. You'll purchase your mercy properly, and the Republic will give you a court instead of the scrape of a boot." Grievous' cough became a laugh, and then something ugly. "Mercy is a word your Republic keeps in its pocket and brings out when it needs to feel taller. I prefer currency that works." He flung back his cloak and 4 arms unfolded, elegant and appalling. "Do you hear that? The sound of air over the hole. That is this world calling down to the dark. It asks if anyone is listening. I am listening. Are you?" The first 2 Magnaguards stepped forward, and Obi-Wan slid down from the Varactol, his boots on the deck, his saber in his hand, with a sound he never lost the habit of appreciating. A promise of order, sung through a crystal. His breath slowed. The world widened and sharpened around the edges. He did not make the mistake of watching only Grievous. The guards, in their habit of being antechambers to catastrophe, deserved as much respect as any lord. The first staff came in low, the second high. He yielded to the low strike, drew the high line away with the close-angled economy that had made Suresu a song in his bones. He felt the jolt up his elbow, and made the jolt a glance in footwork, a turn of the hip. The second staff flicked in a feint for his knee, and he stepped onto a seam of decking where the Varactol's scuff had left a smear of moisture. His heel slid a finger width. He adjusted, and the Force moved under the adjustment with its endless quiet. There. So his weight settled again, and the staff's crack only clipped the edge of his robe. He struck the near droid at the joint under the shoulder. It staggered backward with a sound like a jar dropped in a market, a cascade of ceramic and metal, and the second droid, thinking to catch him as he pressed, swung wide. Obi-Wan lifted his saber and the guard's staff, so cleverly designed to drink light and deliver it back in pain, died with a sputter when its power conduit met the blade's drink of everything. They were very good. He had seen so many good things destroy themselves trying to prove they were better. He did not mind the irony anymore. It came to him like weather. When the first guard fell, Grievous moved. The general's leap across the gap was a study in ballistic contempt. He traveled with a high, arcing certainty, cloak cracking like a sail. 4 sabers spun into blue-white blurs and then adjusted, each one its own clever wrist, its own long memory of the hands that had wielded it before. The hiss and cry of 4 blades meeting one were a choir that made the wind's restlessness seem like a whisper. Obi-Wan brought his defense in close, because only a fool tried to outrun 4 hands. He built a narrow fortress, doorways closing and opening, corridors shifting as data rotated through experience. A downward chop would have taken his forearm if he had been a fraction earlier. As it was, the blade shaved hair and heat from skin. He stepped inside an angle and turned one of Grievous' wrists off its line. Another blade came up to punish that intimacy, and he made that angle misjudge him as well. It was very nearly a dance. And dances, even ugly ones, were subject to rhythm. He broke rhythm a breath too soon. The wind shoved across the lip, tugging the hem of his robe. He slid a hand to discard the robe's weight and free his hips. Grievous saw the gesture and changed the measure. 2 blades left a space that felt like a promise. The third swept in to guillotine the promise. Obi-Wan found the seam in time, because he always had. The 4th blade slid across plating and deck and cut the rail behind him, and sent a spray of softened metal against his calf. He had to lift his foot to keep from stepping into liquid that burned with a frankness fire never managed. He lifted. Grievous' left bottom wrist released a saber, and the metal digits clenched his lifted ankle. The shock up Obi-Wan's leg was clean and bright. His saber dipped. A blade met it and hammered. The Varactyl screamed, a sound like a drawn sky. Cody shouted something human to men who were already moving because war was habit. The deck under Obi-Wan's other foot rung with the ache of already given blows. He twisted and struck for the general's shoulder. The blade slid along carapace and found a seam. It made a line of light there. Grievous laughed and lifted him by the ankle, and slammed him onto the deck, with a care that felt like affection's cruel brother. Breath left him. The force pulsed in him, an ocean swell under a struck bell. He let the swell carry him sideways and out, rolling with the blow, and came up on a knee with the saber lifted, the guard high to cover what had become a low position. Grievous' other hand caught a section of decking and tore it free, and flung it with lazy violence. Obi-Wan cut it in 2, the halves clanging and skittering like angry plates. Blaster fire reached them from behind the magguards. Cody's men had sighted shots through the gaps. Grievous repositioned, always conscious of angles, of what had line on him and what he had line on. A bolt struck one of his shoulder plates and splashed blue-white across a magnetic field. He ignored it as if he'd been struck by a pebble. He altered the balance of pressure with his 2 upper blades, forcing Obi-Wan's guard to lift an inch too far, then letting it drop into emptiness that made the next stroke feel necessary. Obi-Wan recognized the deception and refused it. He remembered the first time he had seen a child try to argue with a mirror. He turned his saber along the inner arc of Grievous' right-hand blade and carved another seam in the armor there, and for a heartbeat it felt as though the fight had taken a turn toward the inevitable outcome he had always believed his steady patience would purchase. A Magna-Guard that should have been a pile of sparking parts was not, and the staff it should have dropped was not on the deck. It came up from the side, under the rail, a dirty sabotaging arc. The guard had crawled along a lower beam out of his sight. The electrostaff's head grazed Obi-Wan's ribs from behind with a jolt that scrambled sensation with color. His diaphragm clenched. His saber dipped to catch his weight because his legs had forgotten him. The blade found the deck and scorched a black kiss across it. He did what years of poise had taught him to do with a broken breath. He lowered expectations. The world narrowed, not to panic, but to a simple alter of placement. Hand here, shoulders down, turn from the waist. The staff came again, and he trapped it against the rail with forearm and blade, and forced it downward. Grievous seized his moment with a clarity that was almost beautiful. One of the general's lower hands closed on Obi-Wan's saber hand at the wrist. Another palm slid across Obi-Wan's cheek and jaw like a parody of tenderness, and then hit him just hard enough to compromise. The skull face came closer. The eyes, those apertures painted with someone else's suffering, brightened. The breath that came out of the general's chest was a saw across wire. Obi-Wan smelled coolant, and something like the memory of ozone after a storm. He moved to headbutt the face at a specific angle where the plating met the mask. But Grievous rocked back a fraction, as if some old muscle memory, a memory that belonged to a man who had once had nerves, had whispered how human skulls behave. The Magnguard's staff slid free and cracked against Obi-Wan's back with a hiss that dyed his vision gray. He felt his left arm refuse him. He felt his right hand, Saber hand, go cold, not numb, but cold like stone that has never felt the sun. He refused panic, as he had refused 100 other things. He did not see the Varactyl leap so much as he felt the deck jump under the weight of her. Her foreclaws slammed into Grievous, feathered neck craned. A beak made for wrenching shell and tendon sought leverage. The general's cough became a wired shriek. One of his sabers touched the Varactyl along the crest and left a line that smoked. The beast flung her head, and one of Grievous' lower arms rotated in a way it had not been designed to, servos grinding. Boga, Obi-Wan said, and the name came out like a prayer and like a farewell, and he did not know which it was. He moved inside Grievous' arm again, because it was the best thing he could still do. The blue-white of his blade met one of the general's at such close range that heat moved across his eyelashes. He drew the saber, rolled his wrist, reversed the grip, thrust for the seam he had opened at the shoulder. Grievous hit him across the face with the back of a hand, and the world flashed the particular white that belongs to a bell struck very hard. He tasted blood and copper. The second Magnguard staff connected with the Varaktyl's neck. The scream it made then had layers in it. Surprise and insult and pain. And then the low vow that animals make when they do not intend to leave a fight. She bit down. The general's head snapped to the side with a hydraulic clatter. He wrenched free with a rip of feather and a spatter of bright blood across dull metal. Blaster bolts hammered the guard that had crawled along the rail. It spun, arms out, staff dropping, and fell into the green air beyond. Obi-Wan forced his breath through clenched teeth and lifted his saber again. He brought everything down to a line as thin as a hair and balanced on it. One step in the wrong direction, and he would have a name for the fear that had kept outside his courtyard's door. He preferred the hair. The Varactyl took a step that put her body between Obi-Wan and Grievous. She crouched. Her feathers were matted with her own blood and burning along the crest where the blade had kissed. Obi-Wan shifted to the right, drawing Grievous' line through the animal, so that any strike had to account for what she would do in the heartbeat of distance. It was not a calculation a human swordsman would relish. Grievous did not seem to mind. He rose, cloak shredded, one hand hanging broken. Chest armor cracked along a new fault, and he laughed in a private, ruinous way. "Look at you," he said, his voice filtered through static. "You still believe you can instruct the world how to strike you? Only that it should try to be polite about it," Obi-Wan said hoarsely, and it felt good to say something human. The staff blow to his back had left a patch of ice in the muscles there. The force moved through it like warm water through a cold pipe, cracking thin sheets of pain into movable shards. The general shifted tactics. Instead of the relentless press that had driven so many Jedi into needless errors, he began to circle, showing angles, inviting choices, making the fight elections. Options were where a patient man with a slow heart excelled. Obi-Wan drew Grievous blades along the edges of his own and felt out the weaknesses in the general's new pattern. The cracked shoulder, there. The misbehaving wrist, there. The lower left leg moved with the slightest drag, there. He touched each flaw with a little pressure, a little taunting admission that he knew the map the general was trying to draw, and had, in his own quiet way, already folded it. He pressed once, twice, 3 times. On the fourth, the deck shifted. A crane above them, unmanned, and as indifferent as a giant insect, had been struck by a stray bolt. Something in its mechanism stuck, then released, and its load, a tangled stack of dull metal slats. Slid. The sound began as a scrape and became a roar. Obi-Wan would later think that if the sound had been a second shorter, he might have made another choice. But it was a second and a half. And half a second's difference is where war collects its talismans. The Varictyl, despite wound and haze, lunged instinctively for open space, a living thing's answer to falling metal. She knocked Obi-Wan sideways. His saber parried a blade with a reflex that had the easy certainty of his own name. His shoulder met something that was not deck, not rail, not anything but empty air held together by gravity's faith. He fell against the rail, and the rail, newly cut by a stray saber stroke earlier, did not hold. It bent with a soft, terrible sound, and the lower half went out into emptiness like a snapped reed. He caught the upper crossbar with his left hand. Agony flared cold down his arm. He hung. Grievous came to the edge and looked down with open curiosity. "How educational," he said. "Even for me." Obi-Wan did not answer. His right hand still held his saber. The blade's weight was nothing, but the promise it represented was no weight at all either. He could not haul himself up one-handed. Once, perhaps, he would have. He found the force again, that patient ocean, and let it fill the forearm, the biceps, the shoulder. He drew breath with a taste of rust. The Varictyl's head appeared above him, her eyes vast and black and frantic. She hooked one talon into the remaining upper rail near his hand, as if to brace the world. Grievous stepped on Obi-Wan's right hand. It was not a stomp, it was something worse. An incremental application of pressure that made each small failure of tendon and bone register uniquely. The saber did not fall. Obi-Wan forced the fingers to stay tight. He made his hand a thought. He made the thought a place. The pressure increased another fraction, and the thought trembled. "Do not pity yourself," Grievous said. "I am not pitiless. I collect trophies. You will be a fine story." Behind Grievous, Cody raised a hand and 3 troopers laid into the general with concentrated fire. At this range, the bolts blew sparks from plating and scored lines like brushstrokes across white armor. Grievous swept a lower blade to deflect, leaned back with reptilian poise to let a shot go past his face, and then, almost idle, kicked downward. Obi-Wan's right hand left the rail. For a moment, he did not fall. The Varictyl had shifted her weight in some delicate way, and he held to the snarled crossbar by his left hand, his body a pendulum. He swung. The Varictyl pushed closer. Her beak closed lightly on the thick part of his robe at the shoulder, as if she would lift him by cloth and hope. He reached with his right hand and found her feathers, hot and slick. He might have pulled himself back along the Varictyl's neck and found the deck again. He might have. The general took one long step, reached, and with the blade he had not used for several seconds, cut the robe at the shoulder with a single neat draw. The fabric tore. The beak was left with a rag mouthful, and the Varictyl cried out, a heartbreak of sound. For a heartbeat more, Obi-Wan hung by the left hand, because he had never given to gravity without asking for a better reason. He thought of Anakin, his difficult light, his dangerous gifts, standing in the council chamber with the chin tilted up in interrogation of fate. He thought of Master Yoda's spare gaze. He thought, unbidden, sharp, and entirely without pain, of a quiet courtyard of memory where a man with a warm, rough voice had laughed at a joke that had not been funny and made it so by laughing. Qui-Gon, he thought, with a sudden, uncharacteristic informality. And then his fingers, which were only human despite training and vows and faith, opened. He fell into green air. The shaft widened as it went down. Utapau had been carved by water and wind, and the peculiar patience of planet building. And as he fell, he saw the city's rings like guillotine blades around the circumference, each with its own arches and doors and sills, each with its own slice of story. He saw the lines of utility cables running like veins, the carts and lifts like vivid beetles. He fell past a man with a basket, and the man's mouth opened, and a string of beads leapt out like birds. He fell until the wind ceased to be a thing that tore at him, and became the only thing that held him at all. Until falling felt like falling feeling, not falling action. He had fallen from great heights in war before, and always there had been some surface that came up in a precise, dreadful hurry to claim him. Something should have come up now. It did not. Utapau made a larger gesture. He struck a catwalk that someone had hung for a purpose that was now irrelevant. It caught him under the ribs, knocked the breath out in a square block, and broke its moorings on one side. The catwalk swung with him attached. He grasped its rung with both hands, and hung again for a moment in a lesser echo of the place above. Pain slipped its neutral mask and showed him a little of its face. He curled the left arm, and it did as asked but told him it would not do more. His right hand still held the saber. The blade had gone out. He did not remember letting it go out. He thumbed it. It came back with a reluctant sap of sound. Above him, a shape crossed the light. A quadruped with talons and iridescent feathers. The Varactyl had thrown herself off the platform in a leap, without further thought than there. She struck the wall lower down, claws biting stone and cable, and scrambled with a kind of brutal grace that turned falling into choosing. She came to him along the wall, like a blue-green wave learning a cliff. Her eyes were wide but not unmoored. She hooked one talon into the catwalk's rung, and the whole apparatus steadied half a degree. He reached and slipped and reached again, and this time his palm met warm skin under feathers, and the world had a handle again. Grievous did not come down the wall after him. That was not his way. He would not commit his weight to a place he could not control. Instead, the general's well-kept shuttle lifted from its spindly cradle like a spider come free of its web. It angled out and away into the sinkhole, and for a moment it seemed it would dive down to finish what had begun. But it did not. It turned outward and away, toward another ring, another ramp, a different set of exits and contingencies. Obi-Wan saw it as one sees a starship through storm, meaning more than shape, and felt the hateful recognition of a pattern resumed. Grievous was already leaving this fight even as he claimed it. That was his genius. That was his ruination. Cody's voice came through a haze. Obi. General, respond. General, respond. He breathed once, twice. Here, he said. And still. He tasted iron, and something that might have been battery. Unpersuaded to let go. Hold position, sir, Cody said. And in the clone's voice there was a tightness, not fear. Cody had always rationed fear into useful sizes, but the fine, polished edge of an instrument stressed near fracture. We're bringing lines. The Varactyl dragged the catwalk toward the wall. Obi-Wan helped, because being helped without helping is a small death that leads to larger ones. He cut the remains of the catwalk free, with a sick feeling that belonged less to pain than to a sense of failing to complete something. He reached for the wall, and the wall obliged. The Varactyl found purchase. Up and up was a labor announced by breath and scrape and small stones that dove away like thoughts he would not have again. They reached a ledge, a lip of service access with a door that had been opened once a week for 100 years, and then closed again. Cody's men had dropped lines, and now a trooper's white enamel helmet appeared above, then shoulders, then a whole man who dropped beside Obi-Wan, and knelt without the clumsy reverence that can turn assistance into an injury. Sir, said the trooper through the muffling of his bucket. Let's get you out of the wind. A man could make a religion from such a suggestion. He allowed himself to lean into their hands, to keep the saber hilt with his right, to rest his left across his ribs, as if his own body had become a set of rented rooms he must not bang into. The Varactyl crouched, beak open, pulling air in slow, shuddering pints. He put a hand on her crest in thanks and in apology. The undercover of her feathers was damp. Blood threaded through in bright lines. She saved my life, he said. Then she's part of the unit, Cody said. And his visor dipped slightly, as if in a nod not so much to obedience as to a sense of the proper shape of a thing. Grievous is leaving, Obi-Wan said. We'll track him, Cody said. He's hurt. Hurt enough to make him cautious. Not enough to keep him from taking what he came for. Obi-Wan's voice was quiet because sometimes quiet had the weight of an order. They moved along the access ledge, 3 troopers in front, 2 behind, Cody at his shoulder. The Varactyl followed with the awkward grace of a large creature in a small space, her claws clicking against whatever metal lay under the thin layer of sand. The door ahead stuck, then grated open, and behind it lay a service corridor that smelled of oil an old rope. The quiet there had a different shape than the quiet outside. It nested rather than hunted. Obi-Wan let the Force pass through him again, the way one lets a river pass without trying to gather it in a cup. The river brought him nothing as dramatic as reassurance. It brought him a list, almost domestic, of what his body required. Water, rest, a cloth pressed where the staff had found his back. It brought him also a gentle admonition not to mistake his own survival for victory. He did not think he was in danger of that. He had survived a great many things, and none of them had felt like triumph. The Republic was a map of such survivals pretending they had added up to a nation. He had never said so aloud. He doubted he ever would. They emerged onto a wider platform, and the sky, which had been a lid, became a bowl. The general was gone. The shuttle had written a pale line across the air toward the far industrial ring. And now that line was only memory. Far below, the green water lay with an indifferent patience that made a man feel brief. Somewhere high above, the war kept its appointments. Cody made a small gesture, and the lookouts on the terraces signaled back and forth in a language of hands. Move. Hold. Det. Watch. Dot. Down on one of the intermediate rings, a squad of troopers had suppressed the last of the Magna Guard pickets. The droids lay in stiff postures, like the end of a grammar. If Grievous had left them with final orders, those orders would now rust. "Sir," Cody said, and he had his hand to his helmet, head cocked. Transmission from the capital. Clearance codes check. A pause, and in the pause Obi-Wan felt a change in Cody's posture that was not posture, but alignment. It was like watching a compass needle swing not to north, but to some other inevitability men had agreed to call north. Stand by. From Coruscant, where the towers made equations of light against the night and traffic moved in layers like a symphony of metal wings, a voice came through the small oscillator in Cody's helmet. It was not loud. Loudness is a poor substitute for command. It was steady and old, and used to being believed. Obi-Wan could not hear its words. He did not need to. The Force made new weather in the corridor where there had been none. He saw it move across the clones like a shadow that had been given gravity. The men straightened. Two of them lowered their blasters and immediately raised them again with a minute alteration in the angle of the barrel, as if they had realized they had always been pointing at the wrong horizon. Cody's head turned toward Obi-Wan in a motion that would have been natural in any other moment. An officer checking on a general, but now had a sculpted quality to it, as if carved out of a single, uncompromising decision. He did not lift his blaster. Cody was not careless. He only looked, and Obi-Wan, who had taught so many Padawans to name the smallest truths first, named this one. Something vast and ugly had just moved on a board he had thought he knew. "Commander," he said softly. Cody's jaw worked once under the helmet. When he spoke, the words were those of a man balancing two orders on his tongue and refusing to spit either out. "We've received a directive," he said, and Obi-Wan heard the edges of the phrase, the places where something else would have fit better and did not. "The High Command has issued a reclassification." Another pause, and Obi-Wan felt it. Not hesitation, but the thoughtfully placed breath of a soldier about to cut a rope, because that was what the rope was for. Effective immediately, all GDR hostile combatants to the Republic. The words were a blade across a taut line. Obi-Wan looked at Cody and saw not betrayal but obedience, an obedience that had not been asked but invoked. He had no illusions left. The order had not been composed in the last 10 minutes by frightened politicians. It had been waiting for this moment, the way a seed waits in hard ground for rain. The Varactyl shifted her weight and made a low sound so deep it was almost below hearing. Obi-Wan lifted his empty left hand, palm out, and Cody, in that flicker of a man that still glowed under the layers of training and numbers, took a very small step backward that acknowledged the gesture. Blasters around them lifted. He measured distance, read lines of fire, counted heartbeats, took in cover. Not enough. Too many. His saber lay heavy in his right hand. The Force moved through him in two tides. One said, "Run," the other said, "Accept." Both were true. He did neither. Doing neither, for a breath, was itself a choice. "Cody," he said, "because names are what men have when orders try to erase them. We fought side by side." "We still are," Cody said, and his voice had the shred of a thing that could have been grief if it had been given an hour. "Stand down, sir." The corridor began to fill with other realities. Footfalls, the small mechanical sighs of blasters charging, the hiss of the wind moving along a new angle. A young trooper on Obi-Wan's left tightened his grip and loosened it again. Another, older, set his feet in a posture Obi-Wan recognized from a dozen skirmishes, a stance that belongs to a man who expects to suppress a target swiftly and move to the next point of stress. These men would not miss. He reached up and deactivated his saber. He saw the surprise move through the squad like a rain ripple. "It will not lessen the injury," Obi-Wan said. He let the saber drop to the deck, the hilt ringing once and rolling to the line of the wall. "But perhaps the memory of it will not make you think worse of yourselves later, when there is space." He offered Cody a small, rueful smile. "This will be untidy." Cody's chin tilted, the smallest nod a man could make without a superior noticing. A tremor ran through the decking, a subtle shiver. For a breath, everything, not men, not orders, not war, became a note in a different chord. The Varictal's head came up, cocked as if hearing something at a frequency that did not cross into human ear. Then she moved. Her lunge was not a lunge at a target. It was a lunge at the way the corridor was arranged. She took 2 steps, threw herself sideways in a full-body gesture that carried Obi-Wan in her slipstream, the way a wave will carry a swimmer whether he kicks or not, and smashed her shoulder into the doorframe to their right. The frame had been weakened by age and wind and the small percussive unbelongings of war. It tore. Stone gave in a scream of grit. The frame spilled them back out onto the ledge, and then down, 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 to a lower ramp in a shower of broken masonry. Blaster fire stitched the air where Obi-Wan's head had been, and carved black signatures into the corridor's wall. "Go!" Cody shouted. The word snapped clean enough that its refusal to be an order was nearly invisible inside the discipline that wrapped it. Obi-Wan ran tight. He ran not with the smooth efficiency he cultivated, but with the profound compromise of pain. The Varictal flung herself along the ramp, claws cutting crescent scars into the decking. Blaster bolts chewed the air a hand's width behind, then a finger's width, then no width at all. One scored the Varictal's shoulder. She stumbled, gained, stumbled again, and Obi-Wan, who had always disliked leaving anyone behind, man or beast, turned and flung a hand back, not with violence but with a vector, and the Force accepted his plan and gave it outcome. A stack of empty containers, spent power cells and oil drums, tilted as if a new wind had chosen them, tumbled and sang their metal song into the corridor mouths. It bought 3 heartbeats. It would have to be enough. Oh, across the gap, bridges and ramps, rails and catwalks, he saw Grievous shuttles slither between 2 cranes and vanish into a vertical cut like a seam of ore. He will deny me even the courtesy of a self-incrimination, Obi-Wan thought. And then, quick and unexpected, laughter rose in him. Not mad, not wicked, only lucid at an angle that made the awful comical. The galaxy promised men clean lines and offered them this instead. A beast bleeding for him, his own troops obeying a treachery cloaked in legality, a machine general scuttling away with a prize he had not earned and yet had absolutely taken. It was almost elegant. Cody's men spread along the upper ring, adjusting their fields of fire. Their discipline reminded him of temple chanting. A bolt caught the Varictal's hind leg, and she screamed the low, hurt sound now. No pride in it. Only astonishment that the world had chosen cruelty again so quickly. Obi-Wan put a hand to her side and the Force went with it, not as healing. It had never been a field he had studied with more than respect. But as permission. "You may carry me a little further, my friend. Only a little. Then no more. Then no more." She did. They came to a place where the ring's structure flared outward into scaffolding, and below that scaffolding lay a mesh network of winch lines, cargo nets, forgotten workspaces. The sort of place that exists in every city not to be looked at, but to be necessary. He flung himself across an opening and felt his left side make its own argument against this sort of enthusiasm. He landed poorly, rolled because he always rolled, and came to one knee in a space that smelled of salt and metal. The Varactyl tried to negotiate the same gap and failed. She caught herself out of nothing with a claw that found the last edge, hung, scrambled, found the net intended for cargo, and tore it with her weight, until strands snapped with sound like harp strings plucked by a giant who despised music. Troopers moved above, rifles seeking. A squad came along a parallel ramp, with their lane set properly so their arcs overlapped. Cody was with them. Obi-Wan saw the clone's head turn as another voice came through the comm and recognized, with an ache that was not physical, the profound solitude of a soldier being asked to be less than a man. "Here," Obi-Wan said to the Varactyl. "Here we part." He put his hand to her brow, pressed, and let the force slide into her awareness with the softness of falling night. Not a trick. A kindness. She eased, as if a fatigued muscle had been given rest, and he slipped the rope of the cargo net off her foreleg. She clung, panting, eyes on him with a devotion he had not asked for, and had not deserved, and could not live up to in this present hour. He could not give her more time. He drew in breath and gave her the only gift he could. "You did what I could not." She blinked slowly, as if to agree, or to absolve. He moved along the understructure, keeping his profile low, trusting angles, not trusting luck. Twice he felt the tremor of a near miss, a bolt's heat, turned into a kiss of air that smelled of scorched dust. And twice he did not look behind, because looking behind was often a word for wanting to explain yourself to a future that would not listen. "General," Cody's voice called once, amplified now, broadcast "I. You are ordered to surrender. Do not make us." The sentence did not finish, or if it did, the wind took it. He came into a maintenance gallery where the stone had been cut back and polished with the indifferent workmanship of Union men proud of solid work. A set of elevators lay there, old and well-oiled, and presently unmanned. He took the third and sent it down, then slipped into the shadow of the fifth, and sent it up, old misdirection that smelled of the temple's trickier teachers. He walked to the sixth and stood very still. When the fourth door opened, 2 troopers stepped out. He slid in before they had time to reconcile their training with the movement. A hand on a forearm here, a foot across an ankle there, a little pressure to a wrist tendon, a reminder that men do not have to die to be disarmed. The elevator took him down with that universal hum that can be found in 1,000 buildings across 1,000 worlds, a sound that tells a man he is between purposes. The doors opened onto a platform near the water. A few Utapans stood there, heads tilted back, ears fanned with local astonishment that had nothing to do with the Republic's urgencies. 30 meters along, an older woman with cords of muscle in her neck held a coil of rope as if she had been born with it in her hands. Obi-Wan stepped out into the open, and the Utapans took one collective step back, because the aura of a Jedi was easy to name in a place where the air said, "Mine." He lifted his hands, empty-palmed. The woman lifted her chin. "I will take any craft," he said. "And then I will bring it back." "You're the one who fights the White Skull," the woman said, the words flat, not as judgment but as a matter-of-fact naming. "And loses." "Today?" Obi-Wan said with a quick, honest half-smile. She nodded once and threw him the coil of rope. He caught it with his right hand and set the saber in his belt with an old, casual movement that admitted how much of him belonged to habit. He looped the rope around a cleat and pulled a small skiff in from where it had been rubbing its side raw against a battered post. He jumped down into it, and it rocked like a tired animal. A blaster bolt ate a chunk out of the cleat. He looked up. On the ring above, 2 troopers had found angles. The woman had already moved. She threw herself sideways, rolled, came up with a fisher's grace, and slid behind a freestanding fuel drum. "Go," she said, and her voice had no complaint in it, only the briskness of a tied timetable. "No one brings anything back. The water keeps what it likes." He pressed a palm to the skiff's console and coaxed its reluctant engine to an uneven life. It coughed in a way that made him think of Grievous, and he nearly laughed again at the world's insistence on its own jokes. He pushed off, and the skiff moved with an earnestness that forgave the battered hull its sins. A bolt struck the water a meter to his left and blew a white flower there. He turned the skiff under an overhang, and the water immediately began telling a different story. Stone above, water below, a man between. The war became a distant recitation. He put distance between himself and the ring. He set the skiff's nose for a lower exit cut into the sinkhole wall where the water ran out, and a river came in. He felt the force approve as it often did when a plan acknowledged simple physics. Blaster fire faded, then returned a little as angles changed, then faded again. He breathed. Pain began to present its bill in proper denominations. He paid what he could. On Coruscant, the Chancellor stood in his office with the blinds angled just so, and the city a skein of lights behind him, like a constellation caught in a jar. Anakin stood at the window, hands behind him in the posture of a young officer on parade. The Chancellor watched him the way a mathematician watches a proof doing what it must. Behind the Chancellor's eyes lay 3 plans in their shadows. "I have felt a loss," Anakin said. He did not turn from the window. The city's traffic hummed. The hum had a way of getting into a man's teeth. Something has changed. Like a door closing in a room I did not know I was in. "Bendawan." "Yes," the Chancellor said. A syllable brilliant with sympathy, and entirely without surprise. "Reports from Utapau speak of a failure. The general who has plagued our peacekeepers for so many months. He has thrown one of our finest from a height." The Chancellor did not say the name. Names had power. He rationed power. Anakin's breath went in and stayed a moment too long. "Obi-Wan," he said, and in the saying was more than grief. There was the indignation of a boy who believed, in the private temple of his heart, that the galaxy owed him the courtesy of coherence. "Master Kenobi." The Chancellor tilted his head. "I am sorry, my boy." He would not just fall. The words came like stones skipped across a lake, each one shorter, each one sinking nearer the shore. He could not. He closed his eyes, and the city's light made maps through his eyelashes. "I felt something tear." The Chancellor came forward with slow delicacy. He had learned over a lifetime of theater that the best performances made the audience believe that they were doing the acting. "We do what we must," he said, which, translated, meant, "I do what I want, but," and here he let the syllable carry a sadness he had never actually felt. "In the end, we are subject to the common failings. Even the best of us." Anakin turned. The eyes that had once had so much clear blue in them now had a darker weather in their centers. "I cannot accept this." The phrase hung in the air like a vow. "I cannot accept that the order will tell me to sit, to wait, to consider, to submit to its wisdom while it loses everything." "The order," the Chancellor said, and his face made a shape that seemed to be contemplation. "The order will fail you because it must. Institutions ossify. Men like you, alive with possibility, are treated as problems to be solved rather than answers to be heard." He lifted a hand and let it hover, not touching. "There are ways to keep those we love." Anakin took a step, not toward, not away, but into the space the words had made. "Tell me," he said, and for a breath he was a boy again, sandy and fierce and certain that a door could be forced with enough will. "Not here," the Chancellor said softly. "Not yet. There is a student's oath that still beats in you despite your rightful impatience." He moved to the blinds and altered their angle. The city shifted its glitter accordingly. "Go to the temple. Tell them what you have felt. Tell them what you know already in your marrow, that the war has changed shape, that our enemies have changed masks. Tell them that Grievous cannot be allowed to celebrate this victory, that the heart of the order cannot beat as it has. Ask them to send you. Ask for the authority to end this." Anakin watched him, not as a pupil, but as a man standing on a cliff edge looking down at a sea he had always called by another name. "And if they say no, then you will know," the Chancellor said gently. "And then we shall talk again, in earnest." On Kashyyyk, where the trunks rose like the pillars of an old temple, and the air had the wet weight of a dream, Yoda stood with hands tucked into his sleeves, and listened to a silence that had not been there a moment before. The laughter of Wookiees rolled along the interlaced bridges with the timbre of drums and old brass. The battle below was a moving chiaroscuro. Shapes in the green gloom, bright people, and dark machines. All of it made comprehensible by the regular punctuation of orders in different languages. He listened under all of this, and what he did not hear was a voice he had, for many years, expected to hear across a life that would go on. The absence lay in the force like a hollow where a tree had stood for centuries and then fallen in the night. He closed his eyes, and in the old dark, there came the faintest brush of a man he had never met in the flesh. "Master," Yoda whispered without sound, and in the trivial grammar of that whisper, Master meant Qui-Gon. Something like a wind that has forgotten its origin moved along the old corridors of Yoda's memory. It did not articulate. It only made the cobwebs alter their drape. He opened his eyes and looked old the way only a species that measured time differently could look old. "Much to do there is," he murmured, and even to himself he could not say if he meant here, or Coruscant, or within the room that had always been inside him where he had kept disappointments folded carefully like robes for decades. The skiff scraped stone. Obi-Wan brought it into a low, dark space where water had been at work for an age, combing the underside of the city, smoothing edges. He cut the engine and let the currents take him 3 meters farther, and in those 3 meters he allowed himself, for the first time since the staff had found his back, to lean his head back against the skiff's slat and close his eyes. The Force did not abandon him when his eyes closed. It rarely did. He let it fit his pain into its proper categories and distances. Pain was a language like any other. He had no right to pretend he did not know it. He saw Grievous stepping on his hand again. He saw the 4 blades making their different arguments. He saw the Varictal's eye, which had contained no argument at all. Only the sincerity of one being's will to keep another on the right side of a line. "I must go back for her," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear but the stone. "Even if I cannot find myself there." The sound of the water was a comfort. The hiss and slap might have been rain in a courtyard, long ago, when he had sat with a boy who would not look him in the eye unless he was angry. He had spoken then about patience and fear and the threads that bind one thing to another. He had spoken with the confidence of a man offering rope to someone slipping over a precipice. He had believed the rope would hold. He did not know now if he had tied the right knots. A light touched the ceiling. He opened his eyes. A drone, sleek as a knife, its lens unblinking, floated in the cave mouth like the notion of an accusation. He reached for his saber and did not ignite it. The drone made the slightest adjustment and then backed away into the sun, like an insect you chose not to swat. He breathed. He drank from the skin at his belt, and the water's taste made its own argument for life. By nightfall, a dozen little flares of conflict had broken out across Utapau as clones turned their well-practiced security measures inward. The planet had never liked being told what to do. It had never liked it less than now. The local police, who had spent careers settling disputes about rope allotments and water shares, found themselves standing in front of armored men who had marched through fire for strangers and would now raise rifles at neighbors and call it duty. There is a narrow path between defiance and death. Whole cities learn to walk it in hours when empires change their minds. In one of those hours, Grievous reached a shadow dock hidden behind a curtain of rock and a lie about seismic stability. He entered Soulless One with a stiffness that owed a little to injury and a lot to someone who has learned to love his own choreography. He fastened Obi-Wan's saber to a rack with other souvenirs. He touched the scar at his shoulder where the seam had been cut deeper. He turned his head a fraction. A small laughter, private and turned inward, rattled in his chest. He extended a calm line into the encrypted dark where his master lived like a spider. "Lord Sidious," he said, and the modulation in his voice made the name a bow and an accusation at once. "Kenobi is no longer a problem. Everything is as I have foreseen," the answering voice said, with the mildness of a man commenting on weather that favored his crop. "Your departure from Utapau will be complicated. This is by design." I would have preferred simplicity." "Simplicity is for the dead," Sidious said, and though Grievous was mechanical where it mattered now, Something in him, something that remembered being flesh, reminded him that men say such lines too easily. Travel to a rendezvous in the Annex's corridor. Our new arrangements require you to be very visible and then very absent. Your victories are as I need them to be. Grievous angled his head in acknowledgement. I have always suspected that my victories belong to someone else. Suspect nothing. Do as I instruct. The connection thinned, then cut. Soulless One's cockpit filled with the complex, melancholy music of flight checks. Grievous set his hands to the controls, not like a pilot, but like a surgeon at an instrument he respected because he had made himself learn it well enough to never have to respect it for itself. On Coruscant, the temple's windows caught evening's bruised light. Anakin climbed the steps as if he would force the building to confess something. Inside, halls he had run through with adolescent certainty now seemed to him a grammar he had been forced to speak when his own language would have served him better. Masters turned their heads and then looked away. Padawans paused in their exercises, as if a draft had moved through. He carried into the council chamber the smell of the city, metal, risk, fried oils, and the council members subtly rebraced, as one does when a familiar storm comes into the room in a new suit. He told them. He described the tremor, the loss, the way the center had shifted. He spoke more quickly than he wanted to, and then forced himself to slow down because rhetoric was a poor choice when men who loved calm were the audience. Send me, he said at last. Don't fence me with protocols. Let me end Grievous now. Let me go where the fight is and do what I do. We do not have time for debate. A silence, and in that silence, Anakin felt again that particular loneliness that had stalked him since childhood. The loneliness of being necessary to many and known by few. Mace Windu leaned slightly forward, hands templed. We are considering many reports at once, he said. The clones are. There are reports that contradict themselves. This is not the moment for further rashness. Master Windu, Anakin said, and did not add the other names that burned their way up his throat. Coward, stone, galler. Rashness is a word used by men who are too slow to see the shape of necessity. Hold your temper, someone said mildly. It might have been Plo Koon. It did not matter. Temper was the one part of himself that did not need scolding. It knew when it was being summoned, and when it was doing the summoning. Yoda's calm image flickered into being on the center plinth, his small form more actual than some of the men breathing the same air. A loss there is, he said softly. Agree, I do. But not only a loss. A turn. His eyes found Anakin with a clarity that had nothing of power in it, and everything of perception. Feeling it you are. Then, act. The word came out like a thrown object. Act. The council will, Yoda said. But not at your push alone. Then, and the old green face softened in a way that felt like a hand pressed to a fevered brow. Grievous, the war does not end. Even if ended, more there is. And none so. Anakin saw in that moment, not for the first time, that the order would always even if ended, more there is. Anakin recognized the truth inside the strangeness of the words, and hated it for being both. The room seemed too small for breathing. Masters whose faces had been a geography of his life regarded him with the patience of old mountains. He had always suspected that patience, in sufficient amounts, could be its own kind of cruelty. The city beyond, the great, indifferent respiration of Coruscant, pressed at the windows with its endless appetite. He bowed because the part of him that obeyed had been trained with exquisite care. He left because the part of him that disobeyed had not been trained at all, and resented this deficiency with the particular ferocity of things that fear becoming true. In the hall, his steps made no sound because the temple had been built by men who wanted sound to feel unwelcome when it did not bring news. He moved quickly without haste, and the air around him, cool, scented faintly of the oils used to polish old stone, reminded him, as it always had, of a childhood he never truly owned. At the top of the broad stairs he paused and looked down into the nave where students crossed like purposeful birds. A little one with braids along her cheek glanced up at him with frank, ferocious faith. He had once felt that look like a blessing. Now it sat on his shoulders like a yoke he was increasingly certain had been fitted without asking. He went to Padme because he always had, ever since he had been old enough to believe that going to her was not simply a mistake, but a choice that might redeem mistakes. Her apartment looked west, where the sun laid a bruise of violet across the city, and air lanes embroidered the sky with silver thread. She sat near the balcony, one hand along the curve of her belly, as if cupping the idea of time. When she saw him, she rose swiftly for someone who had lately learned the weight of waiting. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped a hand's breadth from her, his restraint an offering he had taught himself in hours that had given him very little else. "Something has happened," she said. "I felt it," like the room tilted. "On Utapau," he said, and realized that the sentence he had been forming contained more than that one place. He felt the words catch on a small, unfamiliar edge. He forced them past. "Obi-Wan." Bell. Her eyes closed. For a moment, she held her breath as if sharing oxygen with some other Padme in some other room. A woman not burdened by what she had chosen. When she looked at him again, her gaze was steady. "Are you certain?" "I am certain that I felt him go from where he was. Whether I am grieving a man or a mistake, I cannot yet tell. The council refuses the shape of what is happening. They wrap it in phrases that reassure them and smother me. Sound. And you?" she asked quietly. "What do you wrap it in?" He shook his head, and had the sudden, almost boyish impulse to laugh, because the answer was so simple and so impossible. "You," he said, and immediately wanted to revise it, to soften it with qualifiers, to carve the words into something that did not look like an indictment of everything else. "You and what we made together," he added, and the revision was true, and also a cowardice, and he accepted the mixed character of it, because that was all men ever did when they could not bear a clean truth. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. It was not an offer to obey. It was an invitation to share the architecture of his desire. "Ask me to be something I can live with," he said. "Ask me to end this war in a way that preserves what matters." Her mouth crooked at one corner, a gesture that had once been like sunlight, and now seemed like a light you shield with your hand against wind. "I have always asked you to be what you are. Today, I will ask you to be less certain about what that is." He touched her face, the back of his knuckles along her cheekbone, the domestic intimacy of the gesture sitting awkwardly beside the armor of his thoughts. "I will return tonight," he said, and did not know which part of him had spoken. "You always say that as if the city is a thing that might eat you." "It is," he said. "Only most people learn to live in its stomach." He left her before he made a promise that would become an accusation later. On Utapau, afternoon folded itself into a dusk that felt like a slow closing of the hand. The sinkholes drank what light remained, and the water far below became a single dark eye that did not blink. Obi-Wan guided the skiff along the underlip of a shelf where stalactites had grown into knives that the planet had forgotten to finish. He counted his breaths, because breath was a small currency he could actually control. He steered by sound more than sight, letting the slap of waves tell him how close stone lay. He found a mooring that had not been used in years, and made a knot by feel while his left arm announced its grievances with tidy prosecutorial clarity. When he climbed into the darkness beyond the mooring, the earth took him into a throat that smelled of iron and old fish. The corridor there had been dug with a pragmatism that put function first and then forgot to put anything else at all. He moved at a measured pace, because pace is not only how quickly one goes, but how much one disturbs. A door stood half open along the left wall. He pushed it with 2 fingers, and it swung without complaint. Inside lay coils of rope and a long-handled tool, whose purpose he understood only in the general way a man understands that other men make tools. At the back, a ladder climbed into a slot of dimness. He went up. He emerged in a storehouse, where the floorboards remembered other feet. Between stacks of crates stenciled with local measures, he found a narrow window that gave on to a lower ring. A pair of clones stood 20 meters left, conferring with their hands, their helmets tipped toward one another, like brothers in a secret argument. Farther along, 3 Utapauans carried a stretcher with the ordinary care of people who had been taught early that the body is a thing that requires both reverence and practical accommodations. Kenobi, a voice said softly, and he turned to find the tall, gaunt figure of Tion Medon in the doorway, his cape gathered close, his eyes made enormous by their dark rims. The administrator's teeth showed in what might have been a smile, and might have been a baring of defenses. "I had thought the hole swallowed you." "It attempted to," Obi-Wan said. "But I am tiresome to gullets." Medon's small, dry laugh sounded like thin bone struck with a spoon. "This world prefers food that does not talk back." He stepped forward, looking critically at Obi-Wan's posture. "You can walk." "I can," Obi-Wan said. "I can also speak, if that is a currency you accept. It is one of our few that has not been requisitioned." Medon made a tiny gesture with his chin toward the window. "Your white armored friends have been told a number of new stories in the last hour. They are trying to fix them to their walls." "What they have been told," Obi-Wan said, "uses old nails. You ask me to hide you." Medon did not put a question mark at the end. He put history there instead. "I ask for a way to the open air. And I ask for time enough to make a choice." "Denderu." Medon's gaze shifted to the wall as if he were considering what it had been made for. "I have always preferred to assist men who say they intend to choose. The ones who only intend to act always seem to use up the world too quickly." He moved across the space, longer and more graceful than he looked, and pressed his palm to a section of wall. It swung inward to reveal a vertical slot with a series of rungs. "This will bring you to a service lane. It has at the top a door that has not remembered it is a door in many years. Many no end." Obi-Wan touched the seam with his fingers, grateful in a way that made him wary of becoming a man who thanked others for saving him from the consequences of being himself. "I left a friend," he said quietly. "The Varictal. If you can loosen the net she caught, if you can coax her toward water, I owe her more than I can pay." Medon inclined his head as a man does when someone asks him to honor a debt he would have honored without being asked. "We have handled larger creatures with worse ideas," he said. "Go. Cow. This city eats second thoughts." "And now all." The climb asked his ribs for a statement. He provided one. At the top, where the door had forgotten itself, he pressed, and the panel gave with the obstinacy of old hinges. He emerged into a lane so narrow that men passing one another would have had to decide quickly who owned politeness. He turned right, because right smelled like air that had touched sky recently. He moved with a quiet he had not lost even today. Once a trooper's shadow crossed the lane, and for 3 full heartbeats, Obi-Wan inhabited the shadow, as if it were a cloak. The trooper moved on without turning because training is a comfort, and men seek comfort most when orders complicate what used to be easy. At the lane's end, a wedge of dark opened into a utility platform, packed with spools, and the flayed remains of cable. Below, in the green distances, the water sighed. Obi-Wan stood there long enough to remember that fear rarely arrives with ceremony. It simply occupies whatever space is not presently defended. He breathed until the space inside him narrowed to a room with a candle in it. In that candle's light, choices took on shapes again. "Kenobi," a trooper's voice called into the dark from the left, amplified, formal, shaped by the mask of the helmet. "For your safety and ours, remain where you are, and lay down your weapon." He did not have it in his hand. He did not reach for it. "I do not wish to harm you," the voice continued. And Obi-Wan could hear behind the mask. The man who had eaten beside him, marched beside him, asked him for 3 extra minutes of rest on the long road to a battle where rest had been free and life had been dear. "But I will." "I know," Obi-Wan said softly. "To the air, to the world, to something older than both." The word left his mouth as a sense of the floor changing underfoot left. He stepped without seeing, and felt the boards shift, protesting a weight they had not been promised today. He moved quickly then because the world had altered its angle, and speed was, for once, not indecorous. He leapt onto the top of a spool, rolled and dropped the 3 meters to a lower catwalk that had been built by a man who had not loved his work, but had done it anyway, because work does not require love, only completion. A bolt seared the space his chest had just vacated. He felt the heat nudge his skin like an admonishing finger. He ran along the catwalk, his boots silent because the Force had taught him how to be a rumor instead of a man when rumor served better. He came to a ladder and did not take it, because ladders are invitation. He swung instead to the pipe beside it, sliding with his hands around old grease that smelled like a story of ships. He dropped to a walkway a level above the water. There, he paused, and for the first time since he had fallen, smiled without irony. The world still had a place for him. It had simply changed the locks. In Solus 1, Grievous flew with the stiff grace of a dancer who refuses to admit that the music is beginning to find the places where his body is not young. The wound at his shoulder whispered seditious things into his servos. He adjusted trim and power flow, and silenced the whisper with work. Space opened in front of him like a theater curtain pulled by invisible ropes. He passed from the planet's thin atmosphere, through a scrim of dust where micrometeorites had munched for 1,000,000 years, and then into the clear black where stars behaved. He had always disliked hyperspace. Too clean, too abstract, too much faith. He preferred the space where a bolt is a bolt and a blade eats what a blade must. Still, he set his route with a care the old Kalish general had once reserved for laying ambushes against men who prayed to gods that did not answer. His screens reported traffic in the ring around Utapau, panicked transports, Republic pickets trying to decide whether their mandates applied to a world that was now, by fiat, enemy territory, scavenger craft that moved like insects, arguing over who owned the corpse. He slid among them with the economy of a man who has often been in a room where everyone recognizes him, but no one wants to admit it. He opened a narrow band line to a Commerce Guild relay, and used it not to speak but to allow his presence to be known by the men who needed the comfort of knowing that someone like him persisted. The replies came like beads in different colors. Coordinates, promises, lies. One curse that had the handmade quality he appreciated in curses. When at last he pulled the lever and the starlines drew into themselves, the cockpit filled with the blue-white neverland of safe annihilation. He sat very still and listened. Not with ears, but with whatever it is that remembers what pain is without being able to feel it properly anymore. He thought of Kenobi's hand under his foot and the precise, incremental giving way. He had loved that. He believed himself above love. He sat with the contradiction and found it tolerable. On Kashyyyk, evening laid its heavy hand along the trunks and wrapped the bridges in shadow. The clone commander with the green stripes along his armor approached Yoda with the purposeful stride of a man trying to keep pace with orders that had just outpaced him. The Wookiees' voices rolled and broke and rolled again below like surf. Far out, a separatist transport took a hit and drooped toward the water, shedding black ribbon. "General," said the commander. "Gree." And the helmet made his voice into something deliberate and careful. "Speak," Yoda said. He kept his hands tucked in sleeves, because folding one's hands is often a way of carrying one's weapon. "There is a change." The pause was a small mercy the man gave himself. Orders from Coruscant through the proper channels. Reclassification of Jedi operations and... The sentence did not finish. It did not need to. Yoda looked up at the canopy. A pale creature had found its way into the foliage and hung there upside down, watching with the fearless curiosity of something that had never been punished for it. It blinked. Then Gree lifted his rifle. Yoda moved a thumb width. The movement contained years. The ignition sounded like the word men use when they decide to live. 2 green arcs wrote their old grammar through green air, and 2 heads rose briefly from bodies, as if trying to understand what had just happened, and then fell in the slow, inexorable collapse that all things borrow from trees. The Wookiee chieftain beside Yoda, Tarful, roared one syllable that carried grief and propriety and instruction. Bolts wrote cauterized calligraphy along the bridge. Wookiees answered with bowcasters that thumped in the chest like old drums. Yoda did not run. He unmade running around himself. He stepped 3 times, and each step was a place where a man might have put a foot and died, and because Yoda did not, the men who tried did. He left the bridge's center for the outer fringes, and felt the wood move under him with that checkered affection old things have for those who know their names. A bolt came from a lower platform, where a clone had found a new angle. Yoda raised his palm and the bolt discovered that its nature admitted of other fates. It turned and wrote a small epigram in red through the barrel that had given it birth. Tarful's hand, immense, hot, bearing the smell of sap and fur, closed briefly over Yoda's shoulder, a human gesture made by something not human at all. The chieftain's eyes were damp. It could have been battle, or it could have been everything else. "Come," Tarful growled, and the word had 3 notes in it: respect, urgency, lament. They ran the way men run when no speed will be enough. The forest understood and made room, because forests prefer to keep promises to themselves about what they will shelter and what they will not. At the lip of a high platform, a Kashiekian boma bird burst from a nest, startled, and its shadow crossed Yoda's small form like a prophecy written too late. They reached a flare of light through leaves where a gunship had been hidden, and Yoda placed a small hand to the hull, as if to ask permission. It opened like a mouth. They went in. Back on Utapau, Cody watched the path that the jetty had taken, as if a man could read character from footprints in rust. The directive sat in his skull like a coin swallowed in childhood. Inert, undeniable, foreign diter. He had always known himself a number first and a man second, and he had been content with that grade because men who pretended the inverse too loudly often became problems for everyone. Now the number had made a shape of his day that his manhood resented. He placed the resentment on a shelf, because shelves are for objects that can fall if not properly arranged. Set a perimeter along the lower rings, he said, the words easy as a drill cadence. He likes angles. Deny him the ones he prefers. Be generous with the ones that punish. The men moved. They always did. A trooper, Waxer or Boyle. The stripes told less truth than a voice, and the amplifiers made voices into the Republic's own voice, gestured toward a spooled cable that had shifted. "Sir, you think he went that way? I think he went the way that looked least like the way we wanted him to go." Cody looked down into the green and realized he found no hatred there, neither for the man, nor for the order. Hatred required more space than he had time to allot. He felt instead a missing, like the echo one hears after a blast has gone off, and the world forgets how to be loud for a moment. He did not use words. Words are for after. "We will not give him a second shot at us," he said. "He is not sentimental." He lifted his head. On a far platform, an Utapau woman with gray braids and elbows like knots watched him the way one watches weather. He lifted a hand to signal a squad to move down to the water. The woman lifted her chin, and neither of them moved for the space of 2 breaths, and then both of them did, in opposite directions, which is one definition of civilization. Cody's helmet crackled. "Commander," came a voice from Coruscant, wrapped in officialdom thinner than paper. "All field units report. Progress on reclassification enforcement. Unit 2224, Cody said. Engagement ongoing. Target evaded primary cordon. Secondary operations engaged. Planetary authority, resistant but cooperative." He paused because lies should be small. He gave the lie this small thing. Proceeding. Copy 2224. Asset Reaper requests update on Utapau's main separatist asset. Grievous departed, Cody said. Damaged. Understood. Stand by for additional guidance. The situation in the capital is fluid. Then thou. Cody cut the channel. Fluid, he said. And the word did the thing it always did, which was to make men feel better about the fact that nothing was what it had been an hour before. He gestured, he moved, he did his work. If, very deep under the work, there existed the memory of a man in a brown robe smiling as if smiles were a currency worth spending sparingly, Cody did not take that memory out into the light. He kept it where it did him neither good nor harm. Obi-Wan moved along the low walkway until the water opened in front of him like a dark question. He crouched and put his fingers in it and felt the cold come into him as clearly as any instruction ever had. The green light made his skin look like someone else. He closed his eyes and saw the Varactyl's head as it had hung over the edge. beak clenched lightly in his robe. "I will not dishonor you by calling it a mistake," he murmured. "To the water, to the darkness, to the open. There is very little else that was not." At the edge of the platform lay a craft that had been a patrol boat once, and was now a boat, because names persist when functions do not. He slid aboard, found the ignition, coaxed it with the same patience he would have given a Padawan who lied badly, and felt the engine come alive with all the reluctant loyalty of an old friend. He steered toward the river's throat, and the boat became a thought that made itself true. As he slipped into the channel that led out of the sinkhole, the city drifted backward, rings stacked like the vertebrae of a titan, each a story, each a confessional. Above, far above, smoke wrote a darker gray into the late sky where clones had tried to set fire to clarity. He passed under a bridge where 3 children stood with their ears spread like fans, watching the water as if it might tell them who they would be. None of them looked at him. It was a relief. He had always been uncomfortable being recognized. The river narrowed, accelerated, forgot that it had ever been asked to carry men. He let it teach him its grammar. Rocks here, in recurved shelves. Turbulence in the lee of a broken pillar. Light split into knives around a jut of calcified time. He took his hands off the controls once and let the current correct him, and nearly paid for his faith with the blunt honesty of a rock. He put his hands back and apologized to no one. Night on Coruscant has a way of pretending it is daytime with the volume turned up. In the Chancellor's office, the lamps were a civilized gold against the blue bruise at the windows. Palpatine stood with his back to the city, watching the reflection of the room rather than the room itself. He had learned over many years of practice that men revealed more when they believed they were being watched by the past rather than the present. Anakin arrived without being announced because he had been expected. He stopped at the threshold because thresholds tell men what they are about to become, and one should always pause for readings before stepping over. "My boy," Palpatine said gently, turning with the measured delight of a man pleasantly surprised by the inevitable. "I have been listening to reports all evening. They contradict one another in the way frightened men do when courage has not been supplied in sufficient quantities by their leaders." "Obi-Wan is not confirmed," Anakin said. He felt ridiculous saying the words, as if the galaxy owed him confirmation of the shape of his pain. "But I felt—" He stopped, because he would not put that rawness on display for this man. Even if this man was the only one who had recently spoken to him, as if his feelings were not inconveniences, but instruments. "There are moments," Palpatine said, "when feeling is the only honest measure. I am sorry." The sorrow lay across his voice like silk. Beautiful, cold, nearly frictionless. Anakin moved into the room because standing still made him feel like a patient judged incurable by a physician who had already written the obituary. "You told me once that the Order was a cage. I thought you unkind to say so." "Then?" "I have never been unkind when the truth would suffice," Palpatine said with a little smile. "And now you see what I meant. In their love of rules, they forget that rule exists only to shelter the living. They have sent children to hold walls against fire, and then chided them for smelling of smoke." "Send me," Anakin said. "Send me to Utapau. I will finish what must be finished." Palpatine's eyes softened. "I would, if the war were still the thing men say it is. But, listen." He turned a dial, and the room filled with sound. Not words, not orders. The raw traffic of a city in crisis. Sirens, distant. A voice on a public channel telling citizens to return to their homes and trust the proper authorities. A child crying in a way that made Anakin feel a little sick, because one should not be able to hear a voice like that on a channel like this. Palpatine lowered the volume. "The temple is no longer a sanctuary," he said. "The clones, under orders they do not understand, have turned their discipline inward. The city is shifting under our feet." "Then—" Anakin swallowed. "You arranged this," he said, the sentence not an accusation but a hypothesis offered in the manner of a student, unafraid of being told he is a fool. "I arranged nothing except to be ready for what men had already arranged for themselves," Palpatine said. His face did not change even as he shaped the lie with the finesse of a master craftsman. "An enemy has always sat near the heart of the Republic. Your order has been too proud to admit it, too loyal to itself to protect what it claims to serve. You stand at a door, Anakin. You asked me once if there were ways to keep what we love. There are. But doors do not remain open for long. The breath that came out of Anakin's lungs was a small, exhausted laugh. What would you have me do? Come with me, Palpatine said simply. Walk with me into the place where decisions are made instead of debated. Learn the ways of power as they truly are, not as your masters have told you to pretend. Do this, and there are arts, old arts, that can turn death aside. He let the next sentence fall as if reluctant to use it. Padme need not be a name, men say in the past tense. The thinnest sound escaped Anakin's throat. How do you know? I know because I have eyes, and because love is not as easily hidden as your order would prefer. I know because I, too, have feared losing what is mine. He stepped closer. You think you walk toward darkness? You are wrong. Darkness walked to you long ago and called itself wisdom. Come away from it. Anakin stood very still. In the stillness he saw two rooms. One where he returned to the temple, confessed his fear, begged for permission to act, submitted when permission was not given. Another where he stepped over a threshold, and into a place where action might precede explanation. Neither room promised him that he would look in a mirror later and admire what he saw. Only one promised him that Padme's breath would go on being heard in the night. He did not step. He did not turn away. He did what men do when they know they are failing themselves. He closed his eyes. Teach me, he said. Palpatine did not smile. Smiles are for victories that can be seen by others. He lifted a hand and laid it on the young man's shoulder and felt, in whatever remained in him that counted as feeling, the exquisite relief of a long plan finding its shape in the world. Then first, he murmured, understand the wound our enemies have opened tonight. The temple will be a beacon to those who think the old ways persist. It must be reordered. He paused, not because he did not know the next words, but because he wanted Anakin to feel the weight of their placement. You will go there. You will take command of the clones assigned to security. You will ensure that those who would fight a war that has already altered itself are kept from throwing the city into chaos. Then, you are asking me to raise a hand against my own, Anakin said. It was not a refusal. It was a precise naming. I'm asking you to raise your hand for those who cannot raise theirs, Palpatine said. And for the future, that would include your children. He did not say Padme's name again. He did not need to. The river bore Obi-Wan out into a canyon where the world widened into sky and stone. Dawn came faintly along the eastern lip of things, riding pale silver into the lines of rock. He had not slept. He was not exhausted. Exhaustion is a poverty. He had enough left for now. He brought the boat alongside a tumble of boulders that had fallen decades ago and never been invited to leave. There he killed the engine and listened. Nothing followed him that had been made in a factory. He let himself lie along the boards and considered the shape of the day. Grievous was alive and moving along rails he had been told to lay by a voice that had the personality of a knife. The clones had turned their discipline toward the hands that had taught them discipline. The order, never nimble even when it imagined itself dancing, would break in slow cracks. The capital would become a place where words acquired new meanings with unpleasant speed. He could use the skiff to reach a township, and from there, charm a ship out of a man who would wish later he had not been charmed. He could call a name on a channel he suspected was no longer safe, and ask a friend to send a ship that would be aimed at him like an accusation. He could go nowhere and let the world make choices for him, and that, he recognized with a small frown, was what most men did when their lives became too large for their hands. He sat up. I will not be most men today, he said. The declaration had more bitterness in it than he would have liked. He accepted it anyway. Then, because admitting bitterness was a thing, he set the work of the day against it, to see which would outweigh the other. He guided the boat to a path that had been scratched along stone by people who carried loads with a grace born of long practice. He secured the skiff in such a way that any curious boy might steal it later and test himself against the river. He climbed. The path turned into steps where the stone tired of pretending to be path. He came at last into a narrow valley where the air had learned to be still. Here, low houses were built partly into the earth with doorways like patient mouths. A woman sat on a stool braiding cord with a skill that did not require her eyes to be always on her hands. She looked up when he approached, and then lowered her gaze again, because nothing about him asked for less attention, and the polite thing in such cases is not to give a man an audience he has not requested. "I need to reach Orbit," he said. "You need to reach a physician," she replied without unkindness. "I will accept both, in that order." She nodded toward a shed with 2 open walls. Inside, under canvas that remembered better days, sat a small starhopper whose paint had been lacquered by sun into a single flat confession. "It leaves," she said, "when it is paid to. I carry very little that men prefer." She snorted softly. "Men prefer the wrong things, but I am not men." She named a price that would have insulted a tourist and honored a neighbor. He paid from the pouch that had ridden his belt for years and had very little to show for it besides its endurance. She took the credits and did not count them. "You fly?" she asked. He inclined his head. "Often against the advice of my teachers." "Good." She rose with a stiffness that mirrored his own. "I will tell my son I have decided to miss him enough to let his ship go." She paused. "Do you die?" "Not today," he said, and the relief that crossed her face was the purest expression of civic pride he had seen in months. She walked with him to the shed, and together they pulled the canvas off the hopper. Dust rose with the satisfaction of a creature disturbed. He ran a hand along the hull with the tenderness one gives a borrowed animal. The cockpit smelled of oil and a man's lunches. He settled himself, and the ship complained, and then forgave him for not being its usual pilot. He powered systems up, watched gauges come alive with a reluctance that was honest, and lifted on a column of air that wavered at the edges like a flame in a breeze. The sky took him as if he had not offended it earlier. Clouds slid underneath with the steady grace of large herds. He cleared the cantonment of canyon and leveled. Ahead, above, the thin stratified blue thinned to that peculiar almost black where planets begin to pretend they are not responsible for men. He adjusted pitch and heard, far back in the ship, a noise that suggested a part would ask for retirement soon. He promised the part a kinder owner if it did not insist on retirement just now. He broke into space with the feeling, always a little unexpected, that gravity is a habit men cannot kick but can sometimes forget for an afternoon. Utapau curved below, its scars a patient geometry. He set his course to a place where debris fields turned into the polite lanes used by men who liked to be told where to go. He did not intend to remain in those lanes long. He thumbed through a narrowband frequency that had once been only the orders, and now was very likely everyone's. He kept the transmitter off. It is good sometimes to visit places without shouting. He thought of Bail Organa and the quiet decency of a man who had learned to compromise without confusing it for surrender. He thought of the temple's gables against the Coruscant sky. He thought, briefly, of Qui-Gon, and the way certain words had sounded when spoken by a man who did not believe in speaking more than necessary. He had not heard that voice in many years except in sleep, when it sometimes came like weather and left without leaving anything behind one could swear to. Today, he heard nothing. The silence did not disprove the presence. It only proved that hope is not an instrument. He picked an outbound vector that would take him toward a refueling way station at the ragged edge of civilized space. The sort of place where men looked at what you, rather than who. The hopper's engine made a new noise. He adjusted trim. He spared one glance back toward the planet, and in that glance saw, far below, a slash of white along the ring where clones had laid fire. It looked from here like a piece of handwriting in a book he would not finish. On Coruscant, the first smoke lifted from the temple just before sunset and went unnoticed by most of the city, because smoke, like pain, is the sort of thing great cities learn to fold into their evening routines. Anakin stood at the foot of the steps with a cohort of clones whose armor had not yet been scuffed by this new assignment. He felt them arrange themselves into geometry around him, and understood, with a clarity that struck him differently than battle clarity, that he could say words, and they would move according to the shape of his sentences. The temple doors stood open because they had always stood open. The columns flanking the entrance rose with the self-assurance of things built to outlast wars and the men who start them. Inside, the light fell in long planes across the floor, as if trying to make the room into a diagram that would be easy to read. A Padawan came forward, too quickly, and stopped when he saw what followed Anakin. His face tried to hold on to two expressions at once, and failed. He lifted a hand as if he could give a command and receive obedience. Anakin saw his own younger posture in the hand, and did not forgive the memory for being accurate. "This is a security operation," Anakin said. He heard the evenness of his voice like one hears a stranger in a dream. "All non-essential personnel will return to their quarters. Masters will present themselves for consultation in the main hall." The boy swallowed. His braid quivered against his cheek. "You have no authority." Anakin stepped forward because he did not intend to argue in the doorway of the room that had argued him into and out of so many shapes. "I have the authority that exists when men have failed to keep a promise," he said. And the boy's face crumpled because even young pride knows the weight of that sentence. Clones moved past him in disciplined lines that made the temple's space feel suddenly narrow. Anakin walked among them, like a ship among attendant drones. He found himself disliking his own similes. He had a thought, brief and disloyal to every part of himself, that had been trained up to now. Obi-Wan would hate this. He refused to consider whether that hatred would be aimed only at the circumstance or also at him. He felt the refusal land in his chest and sit there cordially. In the main hall, masters gathered with the outward calm of men who recognize a storm and refuse to be seen struggling with their umbrellas. Mace Windu stood in the center, his gaze flat and exacting, his presence a weight. To his left, Saesee Tian's head turned fractionally, the smallest question mark written in bone and horn. To the right, Alporentesis leaned his old body on his staff, and blinked with the unhurried disdain of a creature who had watched empires misname necessity a dozen times already. "Skywalker," Windu said. "Stand your men down." Anakin drew breath, and tasted the word no. Discovered its particular sweetness. "The Chancellor has conferred temporary operational authority upon me for the security of the capital," he said. "The temple is to be secured. There have been changes in classification." "The Chancellor," Windu said, and the name was a blade carefully wrapped in silk, "no longer speaks for the Republic. He speaks for himself." Anakin's mouth twitched. "And you speak for whom, Master Windu?" "The law," Windu said simply. "And for the lives being spent without consent in its name." He took one step forward. Two clones adjusted their rifles, and then corrected themselves to stillness, because discipline is a kind of music, and even men, with guns, prefer to keep time. "Put those men outside my temple." For a moment, the room held a very old question. What happens when two certainties meet? Anakin felt his certainty strain. He lent it his weight, as one leans into a door. "No," he said, and the word crossed the stone and found its place in the history of every other no that had been said in rooms like this by men who believed themselves correct. What happened next did not happen quickly, though later men would say it had. It happened with the measured inexorability of a storm front. Windu's hand lifted an inch and the air itself found a new tension. Anakin's palm turned open in the old gesture that had once meant, "I am listening," and now meant, "I will speak and you will listen." Blasters, which do not appreciate the poetry of a moment, did what they do. They prepared to make arguments of light. The temple stones, being stones, remembered being lifted into place by men who had sung as they worked, and felt something like pity for those who stood upon them now. Later, men would name what came after with names that carried banners and medals and dates. In the hour itself, there were only decisions and the quiet in between them. Out beyond the there beacons of the mid-rim, Grievous brought Solus One down onto a platform that had been made to look abandoned the way a man might arrange his house to look as if he had been gone for weeks, and would not, in all likelihood, return. A Neimoidian in a cloak too fine for the circumstances waited, with his anxiety arranged in careful folds. "General," he said, and the word was both flattery and complaint. "You have been difficult to place." "Did you expect me to publish itineraries?" Grievous rasped. "There have been Recalibrations in the capital. We have received directives of a nature that contradict standing arrangements. Then now arrangements, Grievous said, are what men call promises just before those promises burn. He stepped past the Nemoidian and into a chamber where a holodouble threw pale light up from nothing. He set his ruined hand on the rim, admired the way the light made the scars appear elegant. You will route me past the obvious nets. You will iterate my presence in places that are not my presence. You will tell men who beg for certainty that certainty has been sent to them by courier. Now. The Nemoidian lifted his chin with the fragile bravado of a man who has never been allowed to feel brave in safety. And what will you do? Grievous turned his head fractionally, and for an instant the mask showed, inside the narrow almond of its eye, the flash of something like an old hunger. What I am made to do. Collect more names. He lifted a small object from his belt then. A trophy box no larger than a man's palm. He opened it, and inside lay a braid the color of late wheat. The light gilded it into a thing of ceremony. He closed the box, replaced it. He did not look at the Nemoidian again as he left the room. The Nemoidian exhaled with care, as if to do so carelessly might cause something to break. The Starhopper carried Obi-Wan into the patient black, where ships write in lines, invisible, and only other ships know how to read. He kept to the dark for a while, because the dark is sometimes a friend to men who intend to be useful later. Then, when it became clear that usefulness demanded the risk of raising his head, he flipped the transmitter and threw his voice along a channel that would find the places he needed it to go. "This is General Kenobi," he said, and the saying felt at once vain and necessary. "To Senator Organa of Alderaan, to Master Yoda of Kashyyyk, to anyone else still inclined toward the old definitions. The war has been moved under us. Grievous lives. Clones have been given orders that do not admit of conversation. I will not ask anyone to meet me anywhere specific, because names are being collected like bad debts. But I will say this. If the Republic is to remain anything but a word, the word must be whispered somewhere far enough from Coruscant that it still means what it meant yesterday. Dan." He sent the message braided 3 ways with dumb luck, and old encryption, and the particular faith that men extend to words, when words are all that will fit through the hole where safety used to be. He sat back, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to sleep for the length of one slow recitation of the code, minus the lines he no longer trusted. When his eyes opened again, stars had shifted hardly at all, because stars are not obliged to hurry. The first reply came in a voice he could have recognized across oceans. It bore the crisp edges of Alderaanian dress uniforms, even when reduced to the thinness of a narrow-band return. "General Kenobi," Bale said. "If this channel is wrong, then forgive the presumptuousness of these words, and accept that they were meant for you and for no one else. If it is right, then know that Alderaan's doors are not open, not because they would not be, but because open doors attract the wrong guests. Speak again, and more quietly. If your hands are not occupied, use them to live. We will need you as proof later that we were not all fools." "Then son." He smiled, a small, private arrangement of mouth and thought. Then another voice wrapped around the first like a counterpoint. Old, uneven, carrying humor even in grief. "Alive you are," Yoda said. "As I felt I did. Hidden, now. Hide more. Gather. We must. Not to strike. To survive. A difference there is. Hard, I know." The connection shivered, steadied. "Hurt, you are." "I am," Obi-Wan said to a recording that would not hear his answer, and somehow, the exchange still mattered. He charted a course that bent away from trade lanes toward a place whose only virtue was that men did not go there unless they had been told to. And very few men had lately been told to. In the quiet, he found himself speaking aloud as if to a companion who could be trusted not to make worse of what was said. "I should have died," he murmured, without drama. "Many times. Today, perhaps, would have been neater." He looked at his hands, the right with the saber callus, the left with the new bloom of bruising, and found himself thinking about small jobs. There were panels to be tightened in the cockpit. The throttle's faceplate had a wobble. The nav computer's right-hand key stuck, because something sweet had once been spilled there. He put his mind's fingers around these tiny facts, because large facts had shown themselves, today, uncooperative. The temple's stones drank smoke. Inside, the geometry had altered into a maze where men who had trained to find each other instinctively now found only enemies in places where friends had always been. Anakin moved through the halls with the certainty of a man who tells himself a story that keeps his hand steady. He did not look into rooms that had the wrong shapes in them. He did not listen to the way a young voice changes when it learns, in the space of a breath, that discipline will not save it. In the council chamber, the wide chairs sat like empty thrones at a child's game, waiting to be claimed by anyone who would pretend himself tall enough. He stood in the center, and the room reflected him back to himself on the polished floor. He thought, oddly, of the first time he had stood here and been measured by men who had weighed his fear, and found it too heavy to be allowed. He looked at the chairs, and found himself naming the men who had sat in them. When he came to the one where Obi-Wan had sometimes rested himself with that deceptive ease, he paused and lifted his hand as if to touch the back of the seat. He did not touch it. He let his hand fall. Outside, the city took notice of the temple's smoke at last, the way one notices that the sky has shifted from frowning to weeping without recalling when the first drop fell. In the Senate districts, aides revised speeches written in soft clay while their masters rehearsed being shocked. On a landing platform, a sleek Nubian skiff slid onto its skids with the suggestion of a sigh. Padme stood on its ramp and looked at the temple with a calm that would have looked like indifference to anyone who did not know her. She touched her stomach and listened for the shape of a kick. Nothing. She felt sicker than fear. She felt as though the city had reached a hand inside her and rearranged the furniture. Bail Organa's speeder came down with the impatient accuracy of a man whose life contained too many scheduled adjustments to permit improvisation. He stepped out, and the lines of his coat, always perfect, hung just slightly wrong because he had put it on while moving. A clone captain in blue stepped into his path with a politeness that might have sounded respectful to an unpracticed ear. "I'm sorry, sir," the clone said. "The temple is under security protocol. No entry." "I am the security protocol," Bail said almost gently, and attempted to move around, and the clone, whose job was to enforce rules regardless of language, lifted a hand and did not allow it. Bail stepped back, not because he was cowed, but because he was not a fool. What he did next would require a more careful audience. Night fell in the outer rim with the same efficiency it uses everywhere else. Obi-Wan's Starhopper crossed a region of space that pirates called home, and everyone else called by whatever name men give to places they prefer to believe do not exist. He did not turn on the lights, because lights invite witnesses. He checked the fuel again, checked the seals again, listened for the sort of noise that announces a small part about to become a large problem. He found none. He allowed himself to think about food and discovered, with some embarrassment, that hunger had found him without permission. He ate one of the bars that the woman in the valley had slipped into a pocket he had not known was empty. It tasted like sincerity pretending to be sweetness. He slept again in a way that would have made his teachers sigh. Short, armored, ready to reject the dream when it turned suspicious. He woke to the quiet clarity of space and to a light on the console he had not expected to see. A proximity ping with a signature that was not military, but also not friendly. He lifted his head, tilted it the way men do when they intend to hear better with their eyes, and saw a shape come out of the black. A freighter, old, with plates like scabs. It sidled up the way reckless men sidle up to a question they suspect is beyond them. A voice hammered through. Cheerful in the way men are when cheer is a currency. "Nice little hopper," it said. "Pretty man to go with it. You got papers." "I have authority," Obi-Wan said. "Same thing," the voice said. "Different fonts. I will be out of your way in 2 minutes." "You could be out of everyone's way permanently in 1, the voice replied. "Be polite. Share your cargo." Obi-Wan breathed in, and let patience make a small house inside his chest. "I have very little," he said. "Then you will miss less when it's gone." "Or," Obi-Wan said gently, "you will miss your ship when it is gone." Silence, then a laugh that had more admiration in it than anger. "A fool would trade blows with a man who sounds like that," the voice said. "I am not a fool." Today. The freighter slid off, indolent, in search of easier meals. He exhaled in a way that made the ribs complain again. He felt the ship settle fractionally on a new course, and knew, with the instant recognition of a pilot who grew up in machines, that the nav computer had been telling the truth earlier about a key that stuck. He freed it with the tip of a nail, and thought how odd it is that men believe the small things will wait, while the large things get settled. The galaxy runs on small things. The large things are just brass bands. He came out of his drift near a dead communications buoy that had once relayed the dailiness of trade between two proud planets. He considered. Then he did a thing he had told Padawans to be wary of. He gambled. He pinged the buoy with a pattern the order had used when it needed to speak to itself without being overheard. He did not wait long. The buoy answered by not answering at all. By relaying nothing. By becoming, in effect, a small hole in the listening of men who listened for holes. Through that hole, he said one more sentence into the space where his hope was now housed. "Anakin," he said quietly, "if you are in a room where someone tells you a story about how the future is only possible if you kill the present, leave. I will meet you anywhere there is sky." He did not say Padme's name, though the word moved against his teeth like a prayer he did not indulge. He closed the channel and sat very still, and felt that small house of patience open its windows, and let in a draft that smelled like fear, and didn't immediately feel like a reason to close them again. In the city that had named itself the center of everything and rarely been contradicted, the temple's smoke thickened, then thinned, then drifted into the ribs of the night. Palpatine stood again at his window and watched the reflection of his own hands. They were steady, like history pretending it knows what it is doing. He turned away because there were papers to sign that would make what had been done into the sort of thing that looked as if it had always been waiting to happen. In a corner of the Senate where men who had once told themselves they were brave, now told themselves they were busy, Bail found Mon Mothma, and they spoke in the language of people who have discovered that words must be scarce to stay accurate. "It has begun," Bail said. "It began years ago," Mon replied. "Today is only when the paperwork caught up. We will lose many. We already have." She looked not at him, but at the dome of the temple, through a narrow slit in a curtain, as if by obscuring part of the view, she could make the whole more bearable. "We will need friends who are willing to call themselves cowards for a season." "Friends," Bail said, and in the syllables lay the memory of a man in a rough brown robe, who had once scolded him with a gentleness that had made the scolding effective. "Yes." On Kashyyyk, dawn broke like a soft hammer. Yoda stood at the edge of a cliff and watched 3 transports lift, laden with Wookiees, who had decided to take their anger into the trees, rather than down onto the beach, because the trees had been kind to them longer. He leaned on a stick he could have done without, because sometimes a man, even a small one, needs the illustration of dependence to remind himself of the shape of humility. Chewbacca came to stand beside him, not close enough to crowd. Wookiees have a courtesy that puts most men to shame. Chewbacca said, which in this context meant, if you asked me for my ship, I would give it, but I think this is not the right hour. Right, you are, Yoda murmured. His ears drooped a little, then lifted. Young Skywalker, he added, almost to himself, almost as if addressing an old argument. A door he chose. He did not say whether he thought the choice had been the young man's or the door's. The day lengthened. The war did what it always did when it had been asked to become something else. It pretended to be the same while all the important pieces moved to different places on the board. Obi-Wan's hopper slipped into a cloud of debris that had once been a listening post, and was now a drift of objects without the dignity of names. He moved through carefully, touching nothing, thinking of all the sentences that had died with the men who would have said them. The console chirped, a ghost of a response from someone who had chosen to risk saying something in return to his earlier message. Coordinates, brief as a heartbeat. No punctuation. No signature. A shape of a place in the middle of nowhere, which is the best place to be when everything else has become somewhere dangerous. He altered course. The ship complained and then complied. He watched the stars change their shoulder positions like men turning in sleep. He thought of Cody and felt no anger. He thought of Boga and felt, for the first time in a long time, grief unadorned by practice. He let it come in, crossed to the far side of himself, and sat with it without speaking. There is a kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath before something beautiful. This was not that. This was the silence of a long road laid out in a straight line with no shade. Obi-Wan did what men do in such silences. He arranged small comforts around him with the fussy care of someone who has learned not to trust large ones. He tightened a strap that did not need it. He smoothed a wrinkle in his robe. He set the saber at an angle that made it unlikely to dig into his ribs while he flew. He told himself a story that had one sentence in it. "When I arrive," he said, aloud into the cockpit where no one could accuse him of sentimentality, "I will be asked to choose again." He nodded once, as if to a teacher. "I will try to do better." The ship went on. The stars refused to be impressed. Somewhere behind him, a machine general collected names, and an apprentice crossed a threshold. Somewhere ahead of him, a room would be built by the words of men who preferred whispers, because whispers, unlike speeches, do not make promises to strangers. And in the middle of all of that, between breath and breath, the Force went on being what it had always been. Not a map, not a law, not a promise, but a vast, patient weather that did not care what men called it, and loved them anyway for calling.